James, I wanted to make a video today to talk about the wonderful insights that you have around episode structure. More specifically, I want to use Podcast Graveyard, your recently launched hit show, to talk about how it's structured, how it's laid out, and how you make the show. This isn't about the music and the nitty-gritty finer details, but more our tried and tested episode structure for success. Do you want to tell me about how you start to think about your episode structure, please?
Absolutely, Matt. Thanks for your kind words about my new podcast. Hit show might be pushing it, but moving in that direction. And I do think a lot of it is down to our episode structure. You see, the structure of the show isn't by chance. We have thought this through. We use tried and tested structure. And there are two reasons for that. Number one, we are focused on click-through rate. How many people can we get to click to listen to our podcast episode? And then once we've got them, increase their completion rate. And it's that second part, the increasing of the completion rate, in which the structure plays a big part. And I've never seen shared on the internet anywhere anyone break down their episode structure in detail. So I thought that would be fun for a video. Someone might get something out of it.
Yeah, definitely. So as with all good shows, shall we start at the tippy top? Tell me about the intro that you have built for Podcast Graveyard.
Okay, so the show starts with an episode intro rather than an intro to the entire podcast. This is specific to the episode and what you're about to experience. I open with the word "Dear listeners." That's very intentional. It's because I'm talking directly to the person listening. And I think that a big thing that lots of podcasters miss is to ever actually talk directly to their audience. This is a stylized show. It's delivered in the style of a memorial service. So I have to stay in character, and I chose to always address the listeners as dear listeners, as you'll see that repeats. So I open talking directly to them. The first 15 seconds of what you hear after the intro music is all just establishing the premise of the episode, backing up the title and why they clicked. So they've seen something, they've clicked it because they were interested, and then I'm delivering straight away on what I said in the intro, and I'm building on it. What they then hear is a repeating framework. You can see from this slide that lots of the elements are always the same. We just replace where the X's are each week with whatever the relevant information is. This repeating framework drives familiarity, and it makes someone feel comfortable, and they kind of then associate with being a fan. So whilst it could be thought, oh, well, I want a different intro to every episode because that makes it interesting, I actually believe that having something that's fairly consistent and similar is more powerful. It's also fast for us. This part of the podcast gets recorded after every episode in post-production. Small tweaks can happen to the wording as we learn, but basically someone in the team, a producer, can script this. I come in and record it, and it doesn't take more than a few minutes at this point to get it down.
I think this is a good point to ask you why you don't use what is known as a cold open, where you take some audio from within the show and bolt it onto the top of the show to sort of sizzle the show. Why do you prefer, in this case, not to use that method?
In my audio for the podcast, so if you listen to the podcast on wherever you listen to your podcasts, you don't hear a hook clip. But if you go and watch the video on YouTube, you do see a hook clip.
Okay, so there's a difference there.
There's a difference. So we put a hook clip on YouTube because I think the behaviors of someone consuming on the YouTube as a platform are probably different, and a hook clip is more common and familiar. So we do put a section that we think is of huge value right at the beginning. But we don't do that in the audio experience. We go more down the music and sound bed route to hook them in.
Yeah. That's interesting, the difference in audiences. The YouTube audience quite like that unique piece of footage at the front, but the podcast audience have a long history of established relationship with the content. It's best to give them that framework at the get-go. So once we've done the episode intro, what comes next? Where are we going next?
So we jump into the show intro. Now, this has a fairly simple logic to it. In order for my podcast to grow, I need to do one of two things. I either need the same people listening to more,
Yep.
or I need new people to be listening.
Mhm.
And my understanding of new people listening, which is really my aim, is they have two challenges to overcome. Number one, they have very little context to who I am, what I am, why I am, because it probably came from referral or they saw a random clip on a social media platform somewhere. And so they don't know too much about me. There's no assumed knowledge. And secondly, frustratingly, they're looking for a reason to stop listening. And I know that's true because I do that myself, as I'm sure you do as well. I don't know what it is, but maybe it's a British thing more than other countries. But I know that even though I'm choosing to listen to it, I'm also sort of wanting to hate it as fast as possible and go and listen to something else. I don't know why I do that. So to overcome that, this section is very intentional. I want to establish who I am and why I'm relevant for the show. So what's the unique lens through which you're going to hear this story and why should you listen to me telling the story? Secondly, I want to establish that the show is for you, the listener, so that you know that it's something you want to listen to. And I do that in this case through a bit of education rather than saying, if you are a marketing manager for FMCG brands, because I'm not that specific. So I do it through a bit of education. You go, oh, yeah, that's something I would be interested in. And then thirdly, and most importantly, I set up stakes. What are the stakes of this show? What's the outcome going to be? Why should I hang around? So that's why you see questions till the end. Why did they start? Why did they stop? And perhaps we'll bring some back from the podcast graveyard. That's the stakes. That's what you're hanging around to find out. And so I know I need that in every episode. So this section is pre-recorded and gets dropped into each of the episodes. I did it once and it always goes in because I know I need it there. Some podcasts that we have produced, we move the episode intro and the show intro the other way around. So you would hear this bit first and then the episode intro. It just so happens for this podcast in particular that we decided to put the episode intro before the show intro.
What are the benefits of swapping those round, and what are some of the mistakes that you've seen over the years of what people do to the show intro specifically?
I think it's very nuanced which you put in which order, but depending on your audience, their age, the demographic, their behaviors, and also the style of your show. As we've said, mine is very stylized. It's in the form of a memorial. We wanted to hook people in because we've got no hook clip, so we wanted to hook people in with what this episode is about quickly. So that's why I've gone with the episode intro first. Mistakes are, the biggest one is not explaining who you are and why you're relevant for the show. People just start talking. Like, sorry, I've never been here before. This is what I always think as a listener is like, hey, this is my first time listening to this. I know it's your episode 68, but I've not listened before. Who are you? Why should I trust you on this topic?
Yeah.
Someone told me to listen to it, but I've got no context. So give me some context. And that's the thing that I think most people miss. And it's a real kind of turn off. There's no establishing section.
It's so interesting because your episode 1 of Podcast Graveyard, Greg Rutherford and Andrew Steele did not introduce themselves in their own show, did they?
No, that's the first thing I open having a go at them about that.
So we've done the episode intro on the YouTube. There is a hook clip, and then we go into the show intro. Then we hear an advert.
We do.
We do. Tell me more about your advert. It says dynamic ad here. What's the difference between a dynamic ad and another ad?
Okay, so you've got 2 ad choices.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I suppose you've got 3 ad choices. Don't put one in at all. Seems a bit mental to me. That is a choice. And then you can have what's called baked in. So that's where it's in there forever all the time, or it can be dynamically inserted. This isn't a video about ad insertion, but I'll just say that dynamic ads are also sometimes called programmatic ads, and it's technology that allows you to tag your episode and then record an ad slot separately, and it gets dropped in at the right time in the right place. We didn't mention earlier, but we briefly could, that before the hook clip, some people put ads right at the top of the show.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. What's the difference between... Yeah, I mean, technically, some people would call this a pre-roll, but it's not a pre-roll, right? A pre-roll advert would be before everything, before all of the content. So this is a very early mid-roll, I'd guess, right?
I guess so. I have chosen to put it after I've set up the episode and before I get into the meat of the show. For anyone who wants to know, we use Captivate.fm for our ad tagging because it's really, really affordable. It's a really simple and easy to use product, and I recommend it for that
Super
reason.
simples. Yeah.
If you'd like to have a look at Captivate, you'll find an affiliate link in the description to this
Always
video.
on the sell. He's always on the sell. Right, so we've gone episode intro, show intro, dynamic ad. Take me into the body copy of this podcast.
So I stick to the classic 3-act narrative. I think most podcasts do this.
Do you think people are aware they do it? Like, can you just quickly break down what you think the 3-act narrative is? Because I'm not sure. I think people do it, but I don't think people are aware that they are doing it.
I mean, I think it's become more recognized and more well-known since the rise of the need for social content. It, in its simplest form, means you need a beginning, a middle, and an end. I suppose in its simplest form, the idea is that you're telling a story. This is an important concept that lots of podcasts miss, actually, thinking about
looking at you, business podcasts.
Yes. But a story in some form would be really good, which sort of means that your podcast, your episode, your conversation, your interview, whatever it is, could do with a beginning, a middle, and an end. That is often more, in more detail, that's referred to as setup, conflict, resolution. That's what makes an interesting story. For Podcast Graveyard, that Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 is a brief obituary is Act 1. Learnings is Act 2. And then Act 3, we discuss whether the show should be resurrected or not. You can align that with the brief obituary is the setup. The learnings is the conflict. That's where they had struggles. We talk about the highs and the lows and things they could have done better and that kind of thing. And then the resolution, the outcome, that's the should the show be resurrected or laid to rest. That's where the stakes come in.
Okay.
The idea being you're trying to get the listener to get all the way to Act 3 to find out, the stakes.
Yeah. Let's break down Act 1 then.
So I have a set of questions that have been written in advance. We did this when we were in the pre-production phase of the podcast. We used it for the pilot and then we tweaked those questions after the pilot, and now we pretty much stick to those. I go into 4 or 5 questions in each of the acts. I have a couple of spares as well, just in case things go off course. But pretty much I'm sticking to a fairly simple script. Each of those, that template of questions is tweaked by the researcher prior to the recording. So we'll do do research on the internet and probably a prep call with the guest. And we'll have listened to their podcast that's now going in the graveyard, and we'll have taken our template questions and tweaked them slightly so that they're relevant to that episode. But, the simplest questions nearly always offer the richest answers. So we try not to play with them too much. And contrary to what lots of people may assume, lots of answers to the same questions is actually enjoyable to the listener. It doesn't make them bored, and it doesn't make them think, oh God, I've heard all this before. Because it's the nuances in the answers which is where they really build their depth of learning and thinking, and it compounds their understanding or, what they're deriving from your content. And also that familiarity of knowing the questions, you sort of feel like you're on the side of the host and a true fan of the show. So that consistency of questioning is actually super powerful in a podcast, especially when you're building audience. So especially in your first 100 or 200 episodes, you can't go wrong with having simple repeating questions from episode to episode. And so that's why we have this bank of standardized questions in each act.
Let's talk about Act 2.
So I think we've probably covered off most of the stuff about how we put the episodes together from a structure perspective. But yeah, we tend to keep Act 1 slightly shorter, and Act 2 is the main bulk of the, this is the punch. This is the real depth of the episode. This is where, in a standard 3-act narrative, this is your conflict. So this is where the real value comes for the listener, you would hope.
All right, nice. So then we get to the end of Act 2. What happens at the end of Act 2?
Well, as I'm sure you know, you hear another ad.
Another ad. Well, it's not just another ad, though, is it? You can't just slam an ad in the middle of a podcast, although some people do, or you just put a random jingle in and warn people.
This is the bit that pays the bills. I mean, this is where the value is. So we were talking about ads earlier, and you've got the pre-roll, like you were talking about, right at the top of the show, which we don't use for various reasons. Then we've got that one that happens in the beginning of the show. Now, I use that to promote my own business and products. That's because at scale over a long period of time, if I'm patient, they are more valuable to me than anything I can sell to a third party. And the feedback that I've got recently is that people actually really enjoy it, and it helps build that depth of relationship with me because they understand more about what I'm doing. One of my frustrations with people making podcasts is they don't use the opportunity of these digital sort of billboards that they're building in their shows to promote their own products. They're so busy trying to get someone else to pay for it that they don't realize that they could be using it for themselves.
Yeah, build brand.
This mid section, so you can put this wherever you want. We put it at the end of Act 2 because it's easy to put it there, but arguably you could put it anywhere in the middle. This is us setting up where we're going to put the next ad tag. So the next dynamic ad tag, which I'm a believer you should do from day one of your podcast. And if you haven't done it yet, go back and find a way to put it into your episodes. Now, we do this to make our own lives easy. So we'll finish Act 2, and then we have a section that's pre-recorded. I did it once. It's always there, where you're basically just finding a way to get out of the episode and set up where you're going to put the ad. So I also find this useful because it regains the attention of your listeners. In podcasting, you tend to have two types of listeners, active and passive. When you have passive listeners and there's a quick interruption like this, and it's kind of supposed to be jarring because it brings you back. That
in the nicest possible way.
In the nicest possible way. That catches the attention of your passive listeners. In fact, when I sometimes listen to a podcast if I'm going to sleep, and quite often I fall asleep and then I hear their mid-roll ad and it nearly always wakes me up. So it's all about regaining that attention. Then we put in the ad tags, which is where I would normally put a sponsor, third-party sponsor, or if I do an ad swap, it would often go in there. And if I was going to put 2 ads back-to-back or 3 ads back-to-back, this is the part of the show that personally I would do it. But again, different video. And then so that it doesn't just drop straight back into the episode, we put another line, which is re-establishing those stakes. So set up what's to come and keep them hooked in and hope that increases the completion rate of the episode. So i.e. getting them to the end of the episode, reminding them why they're there.
So we've done our mid-roll signposts, we've had our ad swap and our third-party sponsor. We're into the third and final act.
So this is all about delivering on the stakes for me. You've hooked them in. You're taking them on this journey. You've got to deliver something of value.
Right.
I choose to keep this section lighthearted because I have a lighthearted tone to my podcast. And one of the challenges of something that's entertaining like that is keeping up through the whole episode rather than just doing it for the first 60 seconds and then forgetting what you were doing. So for me, Act 3's questions are very much about keeping up that tone of voice and delivering on the stakes. It's normally a shorter act, a bit like when you go to the theatre, you know that the interval is not in the middle, it's slightly past the middle. So the third act is the wrap-up.
So do you stop immediately? No, he does not. After Act 3, you roll into an episode outro. Tell me more about this.
So this, for me, is about coming to a conclusion and ensuring there's a revelation for the listener. I know that they've listened because they want to be entertained, but they probably also wanted to take something away, and I want to reconfirm and make sure they definitely got that. So I have a first line, which is just a wrap-up exit from the episode. I'm not into the, like, oh, thanks for coming on the show, like talking to my guest. It's all a bit cheesy for me.
Just boot them out, they're gone, yeah.
So at this point, I go back to talking directly to the listener.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my podcast is, the guest in my show is helping me tell a story that I would be telling otherwise. They're just a vehicle to getting across some points.
Right.
It's not all about the guest. My guests, I don't ask them in my show who they are, where they're from, what they do. I just dive straight in with, I'm talking to you about your podcast. That's it. There's none of this other stuff. So the same in the outro. I don't waffle, but I'm delivering on these points. And in short, what's happening is I have a relationship with my listeners, and each week I'm going through each episode. I'm going through these lessons, and I'm using the guest to help me tell these lessons. Not the guest is the person I'm introducing to the listener. So I reaffirm these lessons in I've taken them out of this slide because they're not interested, but we just have a format for writing each lesson so it's quick. And it comes out consistently every episode. My feedback from the people that have been listening is that they really like this section. They definitely are aware of the lessons being there, and they get lots from them. So might be different in your podcast, but some kind of wrap up I think is great. We have a good idea on this section before recording as well. So from the research, from the pre-call, we know roughly what the lessons are going to be because we know roughly what the answers to the questions are going to be. And that stops it being samey. So we consider these lessons so that the narrative of the episode and where I direct the conversation means that these lessons actually land. Because the other thing we do is we build out our marketing from this section as well. We're not just taking random clips from the episode. We're going, what are the lessons? And then looking for clips that fit that and making completely new 60-second reels about these lessons, making carousels for social, making a PDF of the lessons. You know, we've just actually done a mashup video where we take all the episodes so far and reorganize them by lesson. So what are all the things someone has learned? That's another great thing about having repeating questions is you can make content for social media for promotion, which is 7 different people answering the same question. You'll find that people on the internet love that stuff. So that's the idea of this outro. This outro section has got nothing to do with wrapping up the show, as you're about to find out.
So before we jump on, it's interesting to add that that outro is done, that is recorded after the fact. That isn't turn to camera and wrap up. It's recorded after the body of the show has been edited.
Absolutely.
You know what the lessons are and you reiterate the lessons. And this is a massive mistake that loads of podcasters do, is they assume that the value was just in the show. Condense it down and bring it to people's attention at the end is the value add. Don't expect people to listen to an hour conversation in some shows and pull out all the nuggets. Give it to them in one tight package.
Absolutely. And, you know, so we know roughly what these are going to be, like we said, but sometimes they change depending on the narrative of the show. So what happens is we record the episode, then it gets edited and cut down. And so then we have to reconfirm that the lessons are definitely in the episode. Then we script it. And what we'll often do is say, I know, lesson 1, do this thing. As guest said in the episode, XYZ, and it gets scripted that way. You couldn't do that on the fly. And you definitely couldn't do that on the fly because you don't know what got left in and taken out in the edit. So it's done afterwards. It's in total not more than half an hour's work, but super valuable.
Yeah, reduces the stress on the host massively. You don't have to actively listen and think about what to say at the end. So let's wrap up the show. How does the show wrap up?
So next we have that classic call to action. Now, this is also dynamically inserted, so I can change it as the show progresses. What's great about dynamic insertion is you can change every episode going back through time to the beginning really easily. So one of the things you'll notice about podcasts is if you're constantly finding new people, the show that you put out this week is the first one they listen to and they will go backwards. So when you put out new content, you often see a rise in listens to previous episodes. So it's great if you can keep all the ads and all the call to actions and stuff relevant to today. So rather than going out of date because something changed, we put our call to actions to be relevant to date and we dynamically insert them. I'm breaking the rules here because I think you're supposed to only have one call to action, but currently I have
You
two.
are. Do you?
Yeah, I have 2. The first one
What's the reasoning? Tell me.
The reasoning is I'm greedy. No, the reasoning is kind of interesting. So the first one is the call to action, which is we'd love you to tell someone else you think would find it valuable because we know that, you know, referral and sharing is the most powerful way of growing a podcast. And then
Yeah.
Currently, we've been struggling with female guests because it's such a male-dominated industry. So I had a second call to action asking for guests. But that will probably come out in due course. And because it's dynamically inserted, I can really easily change it.
Yeah. What comes after the call to action?
Then we put in cross-episode promotion. So this is a bit like you're on your favorite Netflix show where it's like previously on.
Yeah.
And on many of your reality TV shows that you or I would probably not admit having watched. Coming up,
I don't have a television. Yeah, I don't have a
coming
television.
up next time.
Just podcasts. That's all I consume.
Of course, very holy. So this is really a tick box for marketing efforts. We're targeting people we already know listen to the show and ensuring that they're listening to more. You go back to how do you grow your podcast? Same people listening to more episodes, new people listening. This is ticking that first box, making sure they listen to the last one and that they know when the next one is coming. It's just reaffirming that. We put both these what we call internally last week and next week, we put them both at the end of the show. But in our standard templated format, we often think about putting the last week at the top of the show. Just doesn't make sense because my show is in the style of a memorial service. It would be weird to have it there.
Yeah, yeah.
About as weird
somewhere between the show intro and the episode intro, or before the ad? Like, whereabouts would that go for someone that's thinking?
In that kind of area. I was about to say it's also weird having an ad in the middle of in the beginning of a memorial service, but times are hard.
You did it anyway, so
did it anyway, mate. Did it. So they're easy to do. They tend to get lifted from your, the first line of your show notes or whatever. The only challenge is if you're not far enough ahead in production that you don't know what's coming up next week. Because you need to be at least an episode ahead of yourself all the time. If and when that does happen, we just re-upload an episode when we know what the next week is. So currently, we might have uploaded an episode and we don't know what's happening next week. When we do, we go back, even if it was 2 weeks ago, and re-upload that episode with this.
Swap the MP3 out.
Yeah.
Right. And what do we have left?
Credits. So credits, I think you'll agree, are really easy to do and they up the production value.
Nice to acknowledge people too. It's often overlooked. Working in TV, I was always upset that adverts never had credits on. I worked hard on those.
It's true. And this comes from television. And I can only tell you this, people listen to them. We've had so many phone calls at the production company. I say phone calls, that's a lie, isn't it? It's 2023. Email messages of people that say, I heard your name in the end of XYZ show. I'd love to talk to you about whatever. So I know people do listen to them. And it just is something you record once and it's done.
Yeah.
And it rounds out an episode nicely and it just ups that production value really easily, as I say.
Yeah, it's a secret call to action as well, isn't it? It's hidden in there. Let everyone know who did this great job.
You know the true fans because they've heard your credits. Everyone else dropped off early.
Secret club, credit club,
credit club. So that sort of finished up the episode. I have, which is not on here, I have this weird thing that closes. It's a bit like a prayer, I suppose, that rounds up my episode. So I record the very last line every time, but entirely up to you. Up to you what you do. But yeah, I really like shows that credit the people that helped make it.
Very nice. And that is an entire show structure for Podcast Graveyard. And to be fair, most of our other podcast productions, right?
Absolutely. I think it's a fairly standard industry-wide template that gets varied because different people have different styles. And yes, it might not work if you're making fiction or children's podcasts or true crime. I'm sure there's some variants, but the principles are the same.
Yeah, definitely. I think that 3-act structure is key to keeping people engaged, making sure that Act 3 offers something. And yeah, the outro is so instrumental for that value proposition. Here's everything we've learned. Here, you can go and use it now. Yeah, that's great. So James, can people get access to this template? Do you have a version of it anywhere that people can go and download?
Yep, links in the description.
Nice.
We'll also, to the template, so you've got it. Hopefully this video, and I'm really pleased that we've done this, brings some sense of understanding as to why we do each of these sections and the thinking behind the structure of the show.
Yeah.
Also, in the description, you'll find a link to the podcast. if you want to go
Yep,
check
go
out
listen
an
to
episode
Podcast Graveyard.
go listen to an episode of Podcast Graveyard. Apart from that, you can also
That's
visit
it.
OneFinePlay.com for a whole wealth of resources about content production and all of the unsexy bits of making content. That's what we talk about, basically.
Yeah. So now do we need to do the credits like Sesame Street? Dun,
I
dun.
think that
This was brought to you by James Bishop and Matt Cheney.
On that note,
Thank you for watching.
okay, bye.